Hello and welcome to Culture in Between, a podcast all about exploring the unique experiences of people who grew up in a culture outside of their parents' culture. We are your hosts, Alyssa and Brianna, and today we have the honor of interviewing Juan, whose parents are from Colombia. Thank you so much for joining us, Juan.
Thank you for having me.
Brianna, can you tell me a little bit about how you and Juan know each other?
Yeah, so Juan and I met during our undergraduate years at a university called Stetson University in Central Florida. Both of us were studying music, specifically voice. And we're so excited to kind of catch back up today and talk about a bit of a different topic that I don't think we've discussed before. With that, we'd like to ask Juan if he can just briefly introduce himself.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Nice to be here. So yeah, my name is Juan. I studied with Brianna, as she mentioned, at Stetson University. We sang together, we did operas together. I watched her be a star and shine for the masses, all that stuff.
I paid him to say that.
Yeah. But yeah, I was born in Bogotá, Colombia, and came to the U.S. when I was very young, like around 2 years old or something. So I was really raised in the U.S. In Florida, and I have several musicians in my family. So I just kind of always wanted to do that. I always knew I wanted to do that. So I've been studying music. I got my bachelor's and my master's in it, and I'm still performing to this day, but also doing some other work in between, getting some other skills. But yeah.
So you were born in Bogotá. Have you been back, or did you go back when you were growing up? Did you take trips back there? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I actually didn't go back until I was I believe a senior in high school, or junior or senior, something like that. So it had been a while since I had actually gone back, and I've only gone back once since that. So it's been a total of 2 times.
Wow.
Definitely on my list of places to just keep going back, and there's always something new that you learn about your culture and about yourself when you're back in the country where you were born. So I think I 100% want to do more trips, but not as much as I've wanted to.
Yeah, I think we can say the same about us going to Jamaica. I've only gone a handful of times, and sometimes when I was a baby, I don't even remember. So when you go back to Bogotá, are you there as a tourist, or are you there kind of when we go back to Jamaica, it's like we're involved, we're with the people. That's kind of, is that kind of how it is for you? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely not tourists. It's definitely with my family, my immediate family, visiting old family friends. And it's something really interesting about growing up as an immigrant is that you see people around you like, oh, my parents' neighborhood is right down this corner, and you can't really relate. But then you're back over there, and it's really right down that corner, but all the way over there. And then they're running, there was this one time my dad was running into his childhood friend who we hadn't seen for 30 years, who still lived on that block. So it's really interesting going back and having that experience that you just don't have, as an immigrant in a newer country for your parents.
Yeah, I always feel an appreciation. I was this is where we grew up, and you're kind of wow, it's really cool to kind of experience that, the things they did and all that.
So are most of your family still there?
We're kind of spread out. I have a few relatives in Florida. The vast majority of them are in Florida right now. I think there's a few cousins, and both of my grandparents are still in Florida. My surviving grandparents. Sorry, did I say Florida? I meant Colombia.
That's okay. I had a feeling. I was I think you meant to say Colombia.
Yeah, no, they're both still in Colombia as well as some extended family. But pretty spread out though, I would say.
Okay, it's kind of similar again for us. Is pretty much all of our family lives in Florida right now. But when our grandparents were alive, on my mom's side, they lived in Jamaica, and that's who we would go visit when we went down there. So,
and when you went there to Colombia, one thing for us was we stood out like a sore thumb. I don't know. They knew immediately oh, Americans. I don't know. Did that happen to you? Or I assume you speak Spanish. So
yes.
The language is not a barrier, right?
Right. Well, there's a little bit of stage fright, I'll say, because you'll go to a restaurant or a coffee shop, and you're my grammar is not the best, and I don't want to make a fool out of myself,
Yeah.
So I'll like I was in like an airport, and I was like, it was a Spanish speaking store, and I spoke English because I was so embarrassed of saying the wrong
Oh
thing.
my gosh.
Yeah.
But to that point, I will say there's a balance. There's, obviously we're very Americanized. We grew up in this other culture, but you come back and there's always this sense of otherness that you feel
Mhm.
in America as an immigrant. And you come back and part of that is gone as well,
Mm.
in the sense of just existing, which I found really interesting. I was like, because, I was born there, so I'm, a citizen, and I was doing some like weird paperwork stuff over there having to do with my citizenship. And I was just in this random line in this random government building with all these people. And I was like, this is the most comfortable I've been in this setting, just existing as a person, just being here and not worrying about how others perceive me. And I looked around and it's because like, a lot of people just like looked like me and acted like me and were
Right.
speaking Spanish. So it was really interesting to have that experience and to have that otherness kind of taken away in some ways too.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. That's really cool.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'd like to say I've felt that before, but I mean, there is a certain feeling of like a sense of home when we've been to Jamaica, at least that I feel,
Mhm.
of like, oh, this is where my parents are from. This is where all my grandparents, all my roots are. But on the flip side of that, just going and seeing like my cousin there and some other family and family friends, they do have a tendency to still make you feel very American though, and and kind of point out all the ways that you're very much not Jamaican. So at the same time, whenever I go there, that's like the most American I ever feel. Because when I'm in America, I'm like, oh no, I'm Jamaican, and then when I'm there, everyone's pointing out how different we are. So did you have any sense of that when you visited Bogota again?
Yes. And actually we were at this like show. I don't know how else to describe it, but it was like a show, like one of those like amusement parks where they do like horse shows and that kind of thing. And the guy was asking everyone, "Oh, where's everyone from?" And my cousin takes the microphone and says, "He's from America." Like so everyone looked at me and like I immediately was like, "Oh, I really am not from here." Like so they make sure to let me know in some
Yeah.
ways. So yes.
So
Yes, I do
true.
feel that.
It's so true. Yeah. In Jamaica, people kind of just like would stare at us sometimes. And I mean, there's nothing worse than just having people stare at you like you're like some weird animal or something. And our uncle would tell us, like, oh, yeah, they can tell you're American, like just from like the shade of your skin and all kinds of things. It was
Oh wow.
crazy.
Yeah.
And do you think
Yeah.
like part of it like has to do with like clothing? Because that's something
Yes.
I've
That
noticed
too.
in other
Yeah.
countries.
So, going back to like your upbringing now in Boca in Florida, like you said, you felt so at ease when you were in Colombia because you were around people who looked like you and were speaking Spanish. How was it growing up in Boca? Because Boca is still in South Florida, but it's not Miami. So, what? I mean, was there a big Hispanic community around you? Like when you were in school, did you have other kids who looked like you or had a similar background? What was that like?
hmm So I think it's really interesting because I think South Florida has a huge concentration of Latin American immigrants and or immigrants who come from Latin America and grow up in the States and all that kind of stuff. There's a fair amount, but my parents were the kind of parents that they would move to like a really bad place to get me into a really good school, if you know what I mean.
Okay.
Like, to stay
Okay.
in that district. So I was around a lot of like American born, like white people, basically, like people from this country. So though I had like a fair amount of Latinos around me, Latines around me, I really felt like my culture was something I had to kind of push down in some ways. I couldn't be too much of it. I had to dilute it in some
Assimilate.
ways. Yeah, assimilate.
Yes.
There we go. That's the word I was looking for. And I really felt that, especially in Palm Beach County and in Boca Raton, West Palm Beach, and those areas.
That's because I figured, like you said, Boca is still part of South Florida. So and us growing up in Miami, I think we almost got spoiled. It's because like almost more people speak Spanish than English, like especially where we were. So it's like I just figured South Florida, everywhere in South Florida is just kind of like that. So, but this was really interesting to hear that actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's like I think part of it, oh my gosh, I just like completely lost the thought I had going.
You're fine.
No
You're
worries.
totally fine. It happens all the time.
Yeah.
If it comes back to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll
Feel free
just
to-
snap just so you can.
There you go.
Wait,
There you go.
it's back. Yeah. No worries.
No worries.
No worries. No, but I was just going to add on to that. I've been to your house before. I don't know if like, you moved or whatever, but I've been to your I've been to your house before in Boca, and that's one of the only times I think I've really been to Boca. It's like one of those places that we kind of passed through growing up in Miami, but you don't really stop. And I remember like kind of looking around, or like every time I have been going through Boca, I've kind of noticed that it's like, okay, it's like interesting. It's like not, it still has that South Florida flavor, but it is definitely getting more into that like West Palm Beach.
Also, like in the performing arts, like Brianna, like I'm sure you feel this too, that like you go into the performing arts. I went to a performing arts high school, and there are people very rich people who pass up on their private schools to get into that school. And so there you really feel like really like that rich kind of like norm of, oh, I have this allowance of $500 a week or that kind of thing. Like where you really feel like that, oh, why am I not like that? You know, why am I not like these people? Or you really feel this need to assimilate into that. A lot of my friend groups at the time are white people. So really interesting to think about because like, yeah, you have Miami and you have this big collection of Caribbean, Latin American people. And then you go a little bit, like even still in the South Florida.
A little bit.
And yeah, you have this
Crazy.
Big
Yeah.
mix.
Speaking of allowance, that just made me think. I think I asked my mom for an allowance because I did go to a school that was like, it was predominantly white. I think when I was in elementary school, people got allowances there. And I asked my mom for allowance. And she looked at me and was like, do you work? She was like, do you earn money in this house? Allowance? She looked at me like I was crazy. And so I was like, okay, that's, yeah.
She's
I
like,
don't
I'm
know.
allowing you to stay under
Yeah,
this roof.
Yes,
Basically.
exactly.
So I don't know if you've had similar experiences, but that was my mom's experience. And I was like, well, Steven gets an allowance. How come I? Yeah. She's
not
like, yeah, well,
happening.
no.
So, how did your parents choose to move to Boca? Because, like we said, I mean, Miami is not far, just like around 45 minutes away. Why Boca? Why do you think they chose that area?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's kind of back to what I was saying before. You know, it's all about the schools. And I think that's really how they planned a lot of their moves was around my education and making sure I was getting the best. Like, one time I remember this middle school that I was going to enroll in that I was zoned for. The principal was mentioning something about bullying, saying like, oh, it's your responsibility to fix the relationships with your fellow student body. Like, we don't have anything to do with that. And my mom was like, huh? Like, what?
What?
Like, that's not how you handle that or address that to parents in any way. And so I remember we like went to another school and like actually moved so that I could be like,
Wow.
actually it was a private school. I went to a private Catholic school for a year for that reason.
Oh my
Because the zoning doesn't matter for the private schools
Right.
in the way it does for the public ones. So yeah, and they really planned a lot of the moving because we moved a lot when I was a kid. And so that was really all planned with that in mind.
Education and making sure you had the right education and were in the right environment seemed to be a high priority. And do you have any siblings or is it just
No, only child.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, I was about to say, I think that also kind of plays into all of this is that you are an only child. So, I mean, I think your parents felt compelled to do that for you. And also, just from my own experience having a sister, it is a bit easier to be like a child of immigrants when you have someone else you can relate to about that and relate to your exact situation as well. Like, you know, went to the same schools as you and maybe has met the same types of people. So yeah, it must have been different just being you.
That's awesome though that they prioritize that. I think that's great that they tried.
Yeah.
That is really
Yeah.
great.
But like more to that point, it's really interesting because it's like I think about it now and I'm like, I think that's why it was so easy for me to lose my culture as a kid. Because that's something I was really like when I was growing up and I was really like when I finally moved out on my own and kind of was studying, I was really adamant about finding it again and finding the music and that connection to people who had similar experiences. And as an only child, it's so easy to lose that and be swayed by people around you. I actually didn't even make that connection until you just mentioned it.
Oh, yeah, no, that's understandable. I mean, Alyssa and I kind of always say, not to like make you feel bad, but Alyssa and I are always like, well, we're always like, oh, what would we do without each other? Like, because just we have crazy Jamaican parents and like just a crazy Jamaican upbringing. So it's just like I can't imagine not having her to talk to about certain things.
It normalizes some things, I guess, because it wasn't until I moved I went to college and lived with people outside of my house, and I was like, oh, like I did things that were kind of different, or I pronounced things a certain way, and I was like, oh, okay, like you don't realize it's different or whatever until you kind of aren't in your bubble, and so yeah, that was kind of interesting. So that's kind of nice to be able to like bounce ideas off. Yeah, I think that's just how Jamaicans are. I don't know,
Yeah,
so,
yeah, certain phrases and stuff. We're like,
yeah,
oh, okay, that's not what American people say. All right, okay, cool. Just us, just
yeah.
the two of us. All right. So you kind of felt like you had to kind of tape down your culture growing up, but were there certain things that your parents really made sure to pass on to you from their culture while you were growing up?
Yeah, definitely the language. I mean, I can probably think of maybe one or two conversations in my entire lifetime I had with my father in English. You
Oh,
know,
really?
like
Oh,
we've like really like I came home and it was just Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
And I appreciate my parents so much for that because it's like now I get to pass this tongue on, and it's so important in terms of connecting with my culture again, and that need that I found later on to connect with
Mm-hmm.
it. You know, it's been something I was really grateful that they
Yeah.
ingrained in me.
Yeah, and I feel like, I mean, because I've seen both sides where some parents intentionally don't actually teach their
Hmm.
kids the language because they want them to assimilate even more. But I feel like it's almost a disservice and it's harder. Because if you do want to go back to Colombia, like, well, you wouldn't be
Hmm.
able to speak the language, and there's that
Right.
disconnect. So I think that's great that they, yeah, taught that to you. And Spanish is something I've always wanted to learn. Geez, one
Hmm.
of these days I will do it. But that's
Yeah.
amazing, though, because I do think, knowing the language is so important to
Yeah.
connecting with the culture.
And like you think about like a grandparent who
Mm-hmm.
like especially my grandparents who are still in
Yeah.
Colombia and haven't learned any English. It's
Right.
like like I couldn't imagine. I'm sure other immigrant kids feel this way too, that they can't communicate with some of their family members the way they want to because
Yeah.
they just don't know the tongue. And I'm glad I
That's true.
have that blessing.
Yeah, another girl we interviewed kind of mentioned the same thing that like she wouldn't be able to talk to her grandma, and I just never thought of it from that perspective because
Hmm.
even though our parents have accents, it's not the same language. But so yeah, I was like, wow, yeah, the older generation, you would not be able to, and it's just it just makes it you can just connect with them a lot quicker. That's awesome. Yeah.
yeah. And I mean, this is kind of different, but just having a thought about how Alyssa was saying that she wishes she knew Spanish. Yeah, I feel the same way just from growing up in Miami, and Spanish is such an important language there.
Hmm.
I've always felt like that left a little bit of a disconnect for me from my own hometown. It's because I didn't know Spanish. I always felt like I don't fully belong in the place where I actually grew up because there's like a whole population that doesn't speak English that well that I can't even connect to
Yeah.
in where I grew up. So yeah, it's
Yeah.
kind of a different way of looking at it. But
And I feel like when you can speak somebody's language, there's this, I mentioned this in another interview, but there's this YouTuber guy we watch white guy who speaks Chinese. And
Yes, I've
yes,
seen this
Xiaoma, do you know
guy.
Xiaoma? Okay.
It's wild.
He's crazy, right?
Yeah.
He speaks a ton of languages now, but he's mainly known for speaking Chinese. But yeah, and then you just see their face, like when he acts like he doesn't know the language, and immediately, like you see they're like, oh, and they
Yeah.
like that, like, oh yeah, we have like respect for you. I don't know. It's just I can't describe it, but you can see in their eyes how they just like
It's
their
respect,
manner.
but it's also like, oh, I'm like you see like the personality come through more,
Yeah.
It's like part of that guard where it's like I'm speaking this language I'm unfamiliar with. I'm talking to this person it's finding common ground in some ways. It's really whenever I see those videos, I'm always like, I just see how they light up and I'm like, oh,
Yeah,
that's so
it's
awesome.
crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
so going back to going to school and everything, I know that you tried to kind of, again, tape down the Colombianness of you, but did you experience any kind of othering from other students, or did people ever bring things up that were hurtful or just made you feel out of place?
Yeah. I mean, especially with Colombia, there's a lot of material for people to use,
Yeah.
especially with Pablo Escobar and the kind of like drug trafficking that went on in the 70s and 80s. And that was always like a joke. There were always like jokes and puns and twists on my name and that kind of thing. Which, I like took in good spirits, and I was never really like hurt by them. But it was definitely like, this is like, I was named after my grandfather, and it's like, he was a very respected man in Bogotá, and he lived a very important life. He was very, it's just like, it carries that weight in my head for me now.
Right.
And so thinking about how it was just kind of like a joke to some people, like thinking about it now, I'm like, you don't understand where this name came from. There is also like I think I would also play into stereotypes as a way to like appease people too. Growing up, like I would like make the jokes myself, or I would like just to kind of like feel that kind of like connection, or I don't know, friendship with people. So
it's almost like an assimilating bite. Like you're like, hey, I know they think this about me, so I'm just gonna play this kind of role to just kind of like roll, like ride with it, even though it's a little bit annoying, because it's a way of them to just point out that you're different, I guess, and that's kind of annoying. And sometimes you just want to be like, hey, I'm just here, like yeah.
I don't know if you remember this one, but I'm going to provide some backstory for our listeners. So anytime you study voice at a university, at least at the undergraduate level, you are usually required, I'll say required, not forced, required to be in choir. And so Juan and I were in choir together, and our choir went on choir tours every year, a choir tour every year. And so we were on this choir tour, and we were particularly visiting places in the South. And we had a stop in Kentucky, and we were staying with some people that the school and the some people that the school and the venue where we performed had arranged for us.
Yes.
I remember after we were, after that night we stayed in Kentucky, Juan told us about how the people at his homestay, or at least one person at his homestay, felt compelled to bring up drugs and drug trafficking when he found out that Juan was Colombian. So can you tell us, how did that make you feel? It seemed like when you told us, it was kind of in a joking way, but how did that make you feel, and what was your reaction to that? How do you respond when people do that?
Well, so like, it wasn't the only comment. He also made a comment about his landscaper having the same name as me or something, or that I reminded him of his gardener or something like that. Something stereotypical like that.
Right.
And I remember, I was just like, I wasn't even like hurt or offended. I was just like, wow, he's actually saying this. This person's actually saying this for real.
Yeah.
And thinking it's appropriate to someone they just met to just talk to them like that.
Yeah. I found that people, I've heard they're like those kind of stereotypes, and I find that people think that if they say like, say they said, oh yeah, you remind me of my landscaper, and he's a very hardworking person. Like if it's a positive statement, then it's like okay to stay. But it's like, no, you're still acknowledging that. Like you wouldn't say that about like a white person and be like, oh yeah, like you remind me of my, I don't know, like it's just,
like
I don't know
you wouldn't go to like a white friend of yours and you're like, oh, you remind me of my white nanny,
Right.
Yeah.
That's a perfect, a great example.
So.
And it's just, if you just didn't grow up like as an immigrant or as some type of different, I think any type of minority, you have experienced some type of like, someone made you feel different or uncomfortable. Like I don't care what minority you are, I feel like if you just haven't gone through that, you just can't fathom, well, why is that a bad I don't know, because I've heard it, and it's well-intentioned people, but it's like, yeah, it's just like sometimes like, wow, interesting. So yeah, I hear you with that.
Yeah.
You got to just shake it off. I don't know. I find when I was younger, I used to get really upset by those things, but now I just kind of, if you don't laugh at it, you'll cry at it. And it's just, you got to just try to see things from people's perspective and give them the benefit of the doubt and just be like, okay, if we're going to say ignorant things.
Yeah. And is something that has helped me confronting those situations and kind of navigating life. I just like living in Boston, there's this enormous concentration of schools and people from all over the country come to study here. And you just realize people with accents are some of the smartest people in the world.
Mhm.
They come here to study, to advance what they've already learned in their country, and to give that to our country, to give it to this American culture. And that's the thing. It's like it's such a melting pot. I think the US really is. And it's made up of so much contribution from so many different minorities. And that's something that's just a realization. There are scientists, artists, philosophers who have thick accents, who are so intelligent. And so I always think about that and I'm like, you cannot take that away with an accent. You just can't.
Yeah, no, it's so true. I read somewhere, and I can't remember where I read this quote, but someone was saying that some of these like migrant children who are coming here, they can already speak multiple languages. And people get so excited when their kid who grew up in America like kind of learns a little bit of Spanish or something like that. And there are migrant kids coming here who can already speak 2 or 3 languages, and we should be celebrating that and viewing them as, wow, look at what a contribution they could be, instead of looking at them as, I don't know, other. We like to kind of also talk about your culture in general on the show. So I have a few questions about just Colombian culture in general. I feel like I don't know enough about it. So can you tell us, first of all, what are your favorite Colombian foods?
Oh my goodness. So there is bandeja paisa, which is like, it can be brunch, it can be like lunch, but typically you don't eat for a while after it because it's so carby. There is rice, beans, there is plantains, there's pork rind, sometimes there's arepa, and then sometimes there's like steak. Like they really throw
everything.
Everything there. But it's like such an amalgamation of different textures of foods, and it like, it's so Colombian. But I have always like gravitated towards the Colombian breakfast foods. So obviously, like your coffee, so there are these like balls of like cheese. I don't even know how to describe them, but it's like a dough with cheese called buñuelos, and they're like fried, and you bite into it, and it's like this just like melty cheese. It's so good. So like the buñuelos, the almojábanas or pan de bonos, which are kind of like another cheese bread kind of thing. Arepas, of course, are really great. Though I will admit that the Venezuelan arepas are the superior ones. I will wholeheartedly admit that, because they really turned it out with those. But yeah, I really like the breakfast foods.
Nice.
Yeah, I saw some like BuzzFeed food related video, and it was about like Colombian foods, and all of them involved cheese, and I was like, that is my kind of cuisine right there. Like, I love cheese so much that like anytime you have a cuisine that half the dishes have cheese in them, I'm here for it. Yep. That sounds really good. We're gonna try out some kind of quick questions about other cultural aspects. So can you tell us, do you have a favorite Colombian saying? Kind of a hard one. I'm trying these questions out.
If you can say skip too, if you don't.
Yeah, we're trying them out.
This is great to think Colombian expressions. So I don't know if y'all know, but there's like a different word throughout different Latin American countries for like one thing. So like for popcorn, it might be like, oh my gosh, I can't even think about the other countries, but like there's like a different word for popcorn.
Yeah.
Hang on, I almost have to like Google this, because like I need you to.
I've heard about this. Yeah, like literally every country in Latin America and in Spain has like a different name for popcorn.
Really?
Yeah, because I'm like actively trying to learn Spanish right now, and I watched this video where they like went through all the different names of popcorn.
So here's this is according to Google. In Mexico, popcorn is palomitas. In Guatemala, it's poporopo. In Cuba, it's rositas de maíz. In Chile, it's palomitas or cabritas. In Ecuador, it's canguil. But in Colombia, we're used to maíz pira. So it's like, it really is like, I love those parts of like, just like there's one word, there's like one thing has just like a different name throughout all these different countries. So I always loved that.
That's funny. And some of them don't even sound similar.
No, not at all.
Yeah. Interesting.
I did not know that. Cool.
Yeah, that's
a cool
very
fun fact.
cool.
Yeah.
Very cool. Something about popcorn in particular has to be distinguished. Okay, can you tell us who is your favorite Colombian celebrity? It can be Colombian American too.
Yeah. I think so there's a few. Obviously Shakira is like
Yeah.
she does a lot for the culture. She brings a lot of the dance and those aspects into it. I really love Sofia Vergara too. She's
Yes.
so charming, so funny, so great. There was someone recently that I found out was from yes. Did y'all watch the new West Side Story?
Yes, we
Yes.
did.
The actress that plays Maria,
Rachel Ziegler.
Rachel, yes, she's Colombian American, and her voice is just divine. She's a great actress, and so definitely very proud of that
Oh, yeah, I did
representation.
I think that's all of my rapid fire questions. So to wrap it up, I like to kind of ask maybe about one aspect of Colombian culture in this case that you don't like so much, and then what you love the most about Colombian culture.
Yeah. So something that I'm noticing is being kind of addressed by people in Colombia too. Like I'm seeing it more and more is machismo, which is basically kind of this hyper masculine way of kind of being of kind of training young boys or male identifying people how to act, how to look, how to walk, all that stuff. It's so that is one negative thing about the culture that that it's something that a lot of people have trauma that they're recovering from, that they're dealing with as children growing up, whether it be from a family member or from an experience within the culture. So that's one negative thing, but it is really being addressed. Like I'm noticing more and more that Latin American countries, like especially people in like our generation, millennials, Gen Z, they're really kind of like tackling these kind of norms head on. So yeah, so just kind of like combating those norms. I'm noticing that a lot of the people in the younger generation are doing that. A positive thing, I will say, and this is something that I was actually reflecting on recently, was there's just a general sense of optimism from Colombian people that I've noticed in my experience. An optimism in the face of like hardship, in the face of really awful, awful things. There's just this hope and optimism that I've carried through with me throughout my life and through challenging times, that it's something that I've embraced, and it's something that has really helped me a lot and in terms of kind of navigating life and that kind of thing.
That's a very nice, optimistic, and positive note to end on. So we'd like to thank Juan again for joining us today. It was so interesting to hear about his experiences growing up in Florida as a Colombian American. And we hope you will join us in a future episode. Thank you again for listening, and we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you again to Juan for joining us today. Who knew there were so many different Spanish words for popcorn? That's pretty crazy. It was really interesting to learn about that. It was also just so great to hear about his experience growing up in Florida as a Colombian American. That was really, really fascinating, and I'm so glad we got to share that today. And thank you, listeners, for joining us as well. Stay tuned for future episodes. Have a great week, everyone. Bye.